In this film I'm going to show you a completely new way of focusing that maybe you haven't heard about or haven't tried before. And although it's explained in your camera manual, that's not much good when the manual is sitting at the bottom of a drawer somewhere gathering dust. Yeah, I can see I've hit a nerve there. So let me explain. Typically when focusing, you set the focus by pressing the shutter halfway down, holding it there and then maybe recomposing if necessary, and then pressing the shutter the whole way down to take the shot. I'm sure that sounds familiar, but there's an alternative way of focusing that you might prefer, and it does have several advantages. It's called back button focusing, and the fundamental difference between back button and standard focusing is that once you have it all set up, which by the way is very easy, pressing the shutter button no longer autofocuses. Instead, when you want to set the focus, you use one of the buttons on the back of the camera, that is. It's probably best that I repeat that. The shutter button no longer focuses. Now, I appreciate that the thought of having to press another button to focus might seem a bit weird at first. What? I have to press another button to focus? No way am I doing that. Switch this ridiculous film off. But bear with me, because many photographers, including myself, believe it's a better way of focusing. Plus, it's easy to do. Let's take a quick look at the actual focus button on the back of the camera. Some DSLRs, like this D300, have a specific button precisely for this purpose. Other cameras have a button that can be configured to do various things via the menus. Some others might have a button with AEL, AFL or asterisk. It's not difficult to identify the button. So this method of focusing separates, or to use the posh word, it decouples the focusing from the shutter release button. And generally speaking, it gives you more control over the autofocus and can make autofocus easier to manage. Before I start showing you the practical advantages of back button focusing, let's quickly change the settings on a few cameras. As always, the actual mechanics of setting back button focus varies from camera to camera, even different models from the same manufacturer. Who knows, one day the manufacturers may standardise the way settings are changed. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. It's generally pretty easy to change a setting. On my now aging Nikon D300, because it already has a back button specifically for focusing, which actually works straight out of the box, all you have to do is find the setting that prevents the shutter button from focusing. If I go into the menu, I know that it's a special custom setting called AF activation. I just go into that setting and make sure it's set to AF on only rather than the default of shutter and AF on. Like many DSLRs, the Nikon D7100 doesn't have a specific button on the back of the camera for focusing. Instead, there's a button, in this case marked AEL, AFL, which you can configure to do various things. You configure the button using, funnily enough, the Assign AEL, AFL button menu. There's several things you can do, but the only option we're concerned with in this video is the focusing. So I'll set it to AF on, and that's done. On some cameras, it may be a two-step operation. One to configure the back button and the other to reconfigure the shutter button so that it doesn't focus anymore. But on the Nikon D7100 it's a one-step operation. I think Canon were the first manufacturers to implement back button focusing around 1989, so of course you can do it on just about every Canon DSLR using various custom menus. Again, consult your manuals for the exact method of changing the settings. If I showed them all in this video, we'd be here all day and you'll probably start losing the will to live. Now, once you've made these setting changes on the camera, the shutter release button no longer focuses. Instead, for stationary subjects, just one press of the back button will set the focus and then you can release it. And for moving subjects, keeping your finger on the back button will continually focus. That's assuming you have the camera set up to do so, which I'll come back to later. The shutter is still fired with the same full press of the shutter button. Okay, that does sound all well and good, but what are the real practical advantages of back button focusing, I hear you ask? Avoiding finger troubles. Sometimes using the shutter halfway down method of focusing can be quite frustrating. Sure, you can lock in focus by holding the shutter halfway down so that the focus will stay locked as long as you hold the shutter in limbo. But then you'll have to hold your finger there. If you really think about it, it sounds a bit impractical. because if you let go or accidentally lift your finger just a little bit, the camera will refocus as soon as you press the shutter down again. Or, and you've probably done this yourself, you press the shutter a little too hard and you take a picture before you or the subject is ready. Now, with the old method, you'd have to refocus on the subject with each shot. That's how you can end up with throwaway shots where you accidentally focus on something else in the frame rather than on your intended subject. It's easier when using focus and recompose. If you like to lock focus and recompose, you'll find back button autofocus very helpful, and that's because once your focus is set, you can then recompose a camera and take as many shots as you like without the autofocus trying to refocus on what's now in the centre of your picture. And this is especially true when using a tripod, maybe taking a landscape photo. Focus and recomposing when using a tripod is cumbersome and not really very practical. So now you can just place the centre focus area over the part of the image you want to focus on, press the back button and recompose just once. You don't have to adjust the camera position on the tripod again. Also, when focus and recomposing, the exposure might be different between the two framings. So if you're using one of the semi-auto exposure modes like aperture or shutter speed priority, you could end up with the wrong exposure simply because you've exposed for the wrong part of the frame. Now, this won't happen with back button focusing because the exposure isn't set until you press the shutter button. Times when it's hard to achieve focus. Every now and again it can be difficult to achieve and lock the focus, through no fault of your own, of course. For example, you might be shooting in low light, or maybe the lens you're using is a little slow to focus and you're getting that kind of hunting sound from the lens. Or how about this? You go to the zoo or safari park and the animal or bird is behind some fencing, which sometimes the camera locks onto. In all of those situations, back button focusing would be better because although it might initially be difficult to achieve the focus, once you have achieved the focus, you then don't have to do it again. Well, not unless you or your subject have moved, obviously. All of the examples and situations I've mentioned cover stationary subjects. They're not moving and neither have you. Before I continue with how back button focusing can help with moving subjects, it's worth a quick recap on the various focusing modes. AFS or AF single shot. Now, regardless of whether you're using the back button or the shutter button, with Canon's single shot focus or Nikon's AFS, the focus remains locked on the initial subject for as long as you keep your finger on the button. Of course, that's perfect if your subject isn't moving, but if they do move, there'll be a high risk of them going out of focus. AFC and AI servo. Now, those modes are purely for continuous focusing. By the way, don't confuse continuous focusing with continuous frame advanced or burst mode, as it's sometimes called, where the shutter continues to fire as your finger remains on a shutter release button. They are two completely different things. Anyway, again, regardless of whether you're using the back button or the shutter button with the continuous focusing method, as long as you've got your finger on the focus button, the camera will continue to focus on your moving subject. It's really the only way to go for sports, action, children running and playing, wildlife and birds in flight and so on. AFA or AI focus, as Canon call it. This is the automatic autofocus mode and it's a relatively new feature. Not all cameras have it, but it can be quite useful. In this mode, the camera's focusing jumps back and forth between single and continuous modes, depending on the situation. It's sometimes the default autofocus mode in the full auto mode, and it can be great for subjects with unpredictable movements. Personally, I don't use it as I prefer to have control over the focusing mode. So now we've covered the basics, let's look at back button focusing on a moving subject. Just as with using the shutter release to focus, the camera will continually focus while your finger is on the button. But here's the difference. You can continue to take photos even if somebody or some object gets between you and the main subject. For example, let's say you're taking photos of a football match, focusing on a player running with the ball. You've got your finger on the back button to continually focus on that player. But then another player comes across the frame in the foreground. Now, if you were using the old way of focusing, you'd have to take your finger off the shutter release button, so you wouldn't then be able to take another shot. But with back button focusing, you just take your finger off that button and continue to shoot. But that reason apart, one of the main reasons many photographers now use the back button focusing is that they no longer have to switch between single shot and continuous focusing. Yeah, I realise that sounds a bit weird, but this is how it works. Regardless of whether the subject is stationary or moving, you keep the focus mode in AFC or AI servo, or whatever your continuous mode is called. Now if the subject is stationary, you simply press and release the back button to get the focus, either by focus and recomposing if necessary, or using one of the off-center focus areas. You're then all set. Once you've taken your finger off the back button, the focus is in effect locked until you press the button again. So if you do focus and recompose, the sequence would be: place the center focus square on your subject, press the back button to achieve focus, release the back button, then recompose. Now, if the subject is moving, you just press and hold the back button while keeping the focus area on the subject. This all works great, and just as I said, it means you don't have to choose between the single and continuous focus modes. Just keep it in continuous all the time. A couple of things you need to be aware of though. First, when taking a stationary subject using a focus and recompose mode, don't forget to release the shutter button before recomposing. Otherwise the camera will refocus as you recompose. One small disadvantage, I should say, is that at least on Nikon cameras, you don't get that reassuring little beep when the camera locks focus in the continuous mode. But it's a shame, but it's a small price to pay. It's certainly worth giving this focusing method a try, but it must be said that it can be a bit awkward at first, and some people try it and give up, or they just can't get on with it. But now that I've got used to it, like most people, I wouldn't go back to using the shutter release button. So do persevere with it. It will pay you dividends in the long run. Bye for now.